Welcome back, everyone, to more from the Sableyes. I'm here today with Jordan. How are we doing, Jordan?
Not too bad. We've been getting a bit of testing done for Brisbane, and it's all coming to an end here, Mitch. We've only got a couple more days before we're heading off, and this will all be in the past.
Yeah, exactly. That's why our uploads have kind of been a little bit erratic, and they're going to continue to be over the weekend. Our first regional for the season is on this weekend. Brisbane Regionals, and we thought, what better thing to do before a big event than to look at the best decks for that particular event. There's a couple of them on the screen at the moment, but we're going to talk about 9 of them, 5 of them in detail. We'll start off, though, with the ones that we think are kind of honourable mentions. There's a few decks that are going to see play in Brisbane, but decks that I'm not necessarily sure are going to be good enough to win. There's a couple of control decks on there. We've got Pidgeotto Control and Florgestolls, Cephalon GX, and Ability Zard. I'd expect to see all of them. The reason that we've gone for Stall being an honourable mention here rather than one of the top 5 decks is that in Australia, people tend not to play Stall. So in this particular event, I would doubt that would go on to win. But hey, that's just my prediction. I can just see someone playing Florgestolls and winning the whole thing. That would be really annoying.
I'd certainly be surprised if these decks don't show up at all, because I still think that they're, at the very least, tier 1.5 worthy decks. The main thing I think these decks have in common is that they're either easily countered, and they are, for the most part, pretty high radar, so they're either easily countered, so people who are ready for them can choose to include the cards they need to defeat these decks, or there's kind of like a better version of these decks. For example, let's say that Baby Cephalon kind of seems like a better version of Cephalon GX right now, and Mewtwo kind of seems like a better version of Reshizard right now, but they're still good decks. It's just probably not good enough to be in our top 5 for this list, but I still expect to see all 4 of these decks showing up and doing it reasonably well, if I had to guess.
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to talk about these 4 decks and the other 5 decks that are on our list. When we say the top 5 decks, we're not saying like this is the best deck. We think that all 5 of the decks in our top 5 are relatively even. There are some flaws and some positives for all of them, so we're just going to talk about them in no particular order and talk about their matchups a little bit. And I think we're going to start off with the one that if we had to say there was a best deck at the moment, it would probably be Mewtwo and Mewtag Team GX, which is a funny thing to say considering we're looking at a matchup spread here that doesn't really look that strong.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to do an accurate matchup spread for Mewtwo. Unlike all of the other decks, I feel like we can be at least a little bit accurate. But with Mewtwo, the list is just so different each time. There's a few different builds for it, like that Rainbow Energy Tag Cool build that we saw make top 8 at the International Championship in Brazil, piloted by an Australian player, in fact. And then, of course, there's the build that a lot of the US players, I believe, are playing, more of a turbo build with all basic energy and World as like the only supporter for the most part. So those lists were obviously quite a bit different, and those 2 builds have different matchup spreads. So if we have a quick look at the unfavorable matchups, Florgestall is there because there really isn't any super good counter to it. I mean, you've got things like your Espeon Deoxys GX attack to try and take a few cheap prizes, but Florgest does actually have a respectable amount of HP as 120, so it's kind of hard to take all of your prizes by sniping, and you don't really have an efficient way to deal with their Willy Dolls coming in the active every turn without any form of item lock, so that matchup's a bit rough for the most part with Mewtwo. Gardy, kind of just iffy because it's a deck that plays Power Plant, and they've got Ability Charms. It's just got a lot of stuff that can annoy you, and it really depends on what your Mewtwo list is playing as to whether you can beat that deck. You can obviously play the Greninja GX in with some of the lists we're playing to go through those Ability Charms. You've got your Reshizard if you're playing that card to use Double Blaze to just take a one-hit KO on a Guardy, which, even when they've got Flareon Charm, which is really strong. And of course, there's the Turtonator, so you've got plenty of ways to get around them. But you do still have to deal with Power Plant, and a lot of Mewtwo lists at the moment aren't even running the Reset Hole Marshadow, so that matchup can be a little iffy. And finally, the Malamar matchup. Obviously, they're a non-GX deck that can hit you for weakness and one-hit KO you effectively, so that matchup's always going to be bad unless you have the right text for it. They've also got that Shadow Box Mimikyu, which is seeing play here and there, which really destroys Mewtwo if you're not ready for it. But of course, once again, it really depends on what cards you're playing in the list. You can run cards like those Weakness Policy and the Stealthy Hood to kind of try and turn that Malamar matchup into not so bad. But if you're just playing like a standard untexted Mewtwo list, then these matchups are all pretty tough for you.
Yeah, exactly, and that is the key with Mewtwo Mew, is that it just depends what you play, and these matchups seem pretty tough at the outset, but if you do tech for them, you definitely can win. When it comes to its even matchups, there's quite a few in there, and it's funny because these are the ones that tend to just be the big bashy type decks. When Mewtwo gets into a race with some of them, it can win some and it can lose some, and if you're not teched for them, then it just comes down to that flip of the coin, who gets the best draws. Cephalon GX obviously has the advantage of only giving up 2 prizes, so that could come up whilst taking big knockouts on Mewtwo Mews. Ability Zard is pretty even, depending on which one gets going first. I'd say Mewtwo Mew probably has a slight edge in that because you can you've got some more flexibility to take knockouts. ADP is equally annoying to deal with because, again, if they get a good start and you don't, then it's really difficult to come back. But if you get a good start and they don't, then suddenly it's not too bad. And Baby Cephalon, same thing. It can set up and just blow up in your face, and other times it sits there and does nothing and lets you win. So these matchups all just rely on how the decks draw on the day. But again, like the unfavorable matchups, if you tech for them, you can probably just win them.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting to see, like, the Mewtwo deck being a welder deck kind of has even matchups against all of the other welder decks, because I kind of guess that's just kind of the nature of welder decks. They're very explosive decks, and whoever can pull off their strategy for the most part is going to be favoured. We've also got Pidgeotto as a favourable matchup, which is kind of weird to see as the only favourable matchup, because I think depending on what your list is for Mewtwo, obviously there's a whole bunch of other favourable matchups you can add into that list. But Pidgeotto is the one that kind of every Mewtwo list kind of has the outs for it, because every Mewtwo list is playing Espeon Deoxys, which is going to be pretty strong for closing out games. A lot of lists now are playing that Charizard and Breakson GX, which is really strong against Pidgeotto because it allows you to get the exact cards that you need into your hand every turn to deal with their stalling capabilities. And of course, you've also got that GX attack you can declare for 1 energy, which can kind of just make your board really strong again after they've removed all of your resources and all of your energy. So that's a really good out to have against Pidgeotto. So we've got that as favourable. I'd say overall, like, this deck, if depending on what list you go with, you can kind of choose to make at least 2 of those favourable matchups go to even, or if not favourable, if your techs are strong enough. So definitely seems like a deck that can deal with just about anything in the format. It just comes down to how you choose to build it and how you choose to play it. It's a very skill-based deck, so one player playing a deck can vary completely to someone else who has a completely different play style or strategy for a matchup. So probably not the most accurate chart, but I think it's pretty telling of how most of the matchups go.
Yeah, it's probably the most controversial one we're going to have here, but yeah, you could pretty much move any of these decks, apart from Pidgeotto. Pidgeotto's going to stay where it is as long as you don't cut Espeon Deoxys. Every other deck you could realistically move into the favourable column if you play 1 card. Right, so you can put a card in for that matchup and you'll be fine. Most of the time, I'd expect a good Mewtwo player, to be able to do very well, and to have those kind of even matchups being all of the other big explosive decks says to me that that's probably a good sign for the deck, because it means that it's good enough. Like, you can just win, like, by making a couple of good meta calls at the start of the tournament and teching for the right thing. Let's move on to some ones that aren't going to be quite so controversial. We are looking next at ADP. This one is an interesting one because it is very good, right? Arceus, Dialga, and Palkia is very good, but if you start slowly, then you are way too far behind to deal with lots of things. And let's put it into perspective. You have to wait 3 turns before you can Ultimate Ray. And if you miss one of those turns, it can get really, really awkward. So all of these matchups are dependent on how Arceus, Dialga, and Palkia draws. But in general, it has some pretty favourable matchups.
It certainly does. If you have a look at this chart, it's very much leaning towards the favourable chart than the unfavourable one. I think we did forget to put abilities out onto this chart. I think that one's another one that would potentially be in that unfavourable category. But overall, it's definitely got a whole bunch of good matchups, and it's really just a medical, right? Because it's got basically an auto win to Florgestall and Pidgeotto. There's so many cards you can play to win those matchups, such as the Cryogonal, the Zeb Striker, there's the Theon, and things like that you can play just to really destroy all of the kind of combos that they're trying to pull off. There's also Absol, which you can use to annoy a lot of these decks, such as Malamar, which is already a pretty good matchup for you as long as you can pull off that Altered Creation GX. Sure, they could be playing something like Gladios to go for a turn 1 clear vision to prevent your Altered Creation, but even then, it just comes down to a Malamar Lana stalling war, basically, where ADP is still probably going to have the resources it needs to get the job done. But Cephalon GX is probably like the most questionable one in the favorable matchup because you never know, they could just explode and like knock out your ADP turn 2 before you get a chance to Ultimate Ray, and if that happens, it's going to be pretty bad for you. But ADP is typically playing cards like Choice Helmet at the moment. It's a card you can definitely include to have a big impact in the Cephalon GX matchup because 6 energy to discard for an ADP is already a lot if you force them to find a 7th one as well, and that's just going to be really hard for them to do, and even if they get it, it might put them in such a bad position they won't be able to close out the rest of the game. And of course, you've also got access to Keldeo in that matchup, which is really strong at knocking out a Cephalon, taking 3 prizes. You can kind of just win so quickly that they need to draw very perfectly to have a chance against you.
Yeah, and the thing with Blacephalon GX is as well, if you don't knock out the first ADP, then ADP knocks out the Blacephalon and skips Beast Ring, which is pretty bad. So it can be very easy for ADP to just run away with that matchup. You talked a little bit about unfavorable and even matchups here. Gardevoir can be a even or even favorable matchup if you play Lucario or Melmetal. But we put this in the unfavorable category just for the moment because in the last few tournaments that we've seen results from, people were kind of shifting on Lucario Melmetal. Like whether you included it or not depended on how you felt the meta was going to play out. So people weren't playing it because they didn't expect Gardy, so Gardy becomes a bad matchup. If you do expect Gardy, you play the Lucario Melmetal and it becomes a much more favourable matchup. So that one there seems pretty reasonable. But like you mentioned, we're missing Ability Zard on this list. We forgot to put it on. That would probably be unfavorable or even. Mewtwo and Mew and Baby Blacephalon and Ability Zard all have the same thing in common in that they can easily blow up an ADP. Mewtwo and Mew can obviously use Charizard GX if the helmet isn't on there. Ability Zard can use Reshiram Charizard's GX attack, and Baby Blacephalon can just get 6 or 7 energy in hand and take a big knockout, and that's where ADP falls down. If the first ADP gets knocked out before it can Ultimate Ray, then it's in trouble.
Yeah, I think that's the common trend in all of these matchups. The question is, can your opponent knock out an ADP turn 2 with a Choice Helmet attached? If the answer is yes, then they probably win that game. If the answer is no, then they probably lose, unless they've got like another strategy to beat you. That's why Mewtwo's kind of even, because Mewtwo's the one where it's really iffy. Like, sure, it's possible for them to kill your ADP turn 2, but the Choice Helmet's going to make it really awkward for them. And of course, you've got that Keldeo pressure, which is one of the strongest parts of the ADP deck, is that you can just win games thanks to Keldeo being able to block most of the attackers against decks like Mewtwo and theoretically Ability Zard as well. But Ability Zard and Baby Blacephalon both have really strong non-GX options, so the Keldeo isn't very good in those matchups. The only one that debatably the Keldeo is really good against is Gardevoir, but it really just comes down to, once again, what techs each player has played. I imagine that Gardy players know that Keldeo is going to be around. They're going to be playing cards like Power Plant and maybe even Barber or Reset Hall or something to try and deal with your Chaotic Skulls to deal with Keldeo. So definitely seems like those matchups can be pretty tough, but once again, you can tech for them and make them better. This is assuming that we don't have Luca Metal, which looking at the results from Daytona, it seems like Luca Metal might be a good card to consider putting back in.
Yeah, it certainly would. So ADP probably has the, I guess, the most favoured matchups, but when you look at the favoured matchups, they're not ones that we're realistically expecting to see as much of. The even and unfavourable matchups seem to be a little bit more popular, so that could factor into your decision making if you're choosing to run ADP at Brisbane Regionals. Moving on to Baby Blacephalon. This deck is a deck that's almost impossible to make a chart for because you have to presume that the deck's going to set up. I don't know about you, Jordan, but I've played this deck many times and it's just fallen apart very quickly. So now take each of these rankings with a grain of salt. You obviously need to set up to actually make it so that these are logical. We've got a couple of unfavourable ones on the right-hand side. Again, Florges Dolls is really bad for this deck. We don't have like super good Gust. We don't have ability to get like snipe damage. We can only realistically knock out what's in the active, and at some point in the game, Florges Dolls is just going to have a doll in the active, so that's going to be that. And Malamar is just better Baby Blacephalon. It's just as inconsistent, but it has an attacker that you can just recycle. So you probably lose both of those two.
Yeah, there's really no answer for Malamar. I don't know if there's any card you can put in the deck to try and swing that matchup. As for Fortress Dolls, if you're really scared of it, you could potentially try and fit in Team Up Ninetales with its infinite amounts of dust. You could try and salvage that matchup, but I feel like the Ninetales is really weak in Cephalon just because of how important the engine in your hand is. You can't really be affording to Gust very often and still expect to be able to get a knockout consistently. So it's probably the smartest players just to give up on those two matchups if you're playing this deck. Because if we go over to the favorable matchup, there's a whole lot of good stuff going on about this deck. Obviously, you're just kind of a more prize-efficient deck than Blacephalon GX, so you should be able to win a 1v1 trade against Blacephalon GX, even though they've got like Naganadels. They can maybe sneak a non-GX in here or there. You're still just going to have such a big advantage in the prize trade there. And the Abilizard's kind of the same thing. Abilizard, once again, has a lot of non-GX options, so they can potentially trade evenly with you for a little bit, but at the end of the day, they're going to be putting down more GXs than you, which is 0, so you're eventually going to ideally be able to pull off the win there. And then we also see at the bottom there, we've got some of the tag team decks. If those deck matchups, especially Guardy, are pretty easy, because as long as your deck does what it's meant to do, you should be able to win the prize trade very easily. 6 energy to take 3 prizes is super good value when you're playing a deck like this, and ADP, I think, is probably the most debatable one on this list. I could see that being even, especially since there are some text that you can put into ADP to try and swing the Blacephalon matchup back into your favor. But at the end of the day, if Blacephalon just gets the 300 damage knockout on an ADP before they declare Ultimate Ray, even if they've GX, before you take the knockout, I feel like if you take 3 prizes before they take any, you're eventually going to be able to close out the game before they can. So it really just comes down to how quickly you can apply that pressure. And unlike with the Abilizard or Mewtwo matchups, Choice Helmet does not help ADP to survive your Blacephalon attack. So it just comes down to how consistently you draw. If you draw, I'd like to say what you usually consider to be normal for this deck, then ADP should be a pretty easy matchup for you as well.
Yeah, exactly. If we have a look at that even matchup spread, we've got Mewtwo, Mew, and Pidgeotto in there. Pidgeotto's an interesting one. I'm not 100% convinced on this. I've not done any specific testing. This is all just based on a hunch, but it feels like Pidgeotto could potentially get Blacephalon in a position where they aren't able to take as many knockouts as they need to win the game. But similarly, Blacephalon could probably run over the top of it if they get going quick enough. That one I'm not going to talk too much more about because honestly I don't know. Like, we've just put it there. I'm sure people, you can argue about it later. Like, I don't know. I wouldn't want to play that matchup anyway. I got one of the decks that's the fastest to finish games in Blacephalon up against one of the decks that's the slowest in Pidgeotto, so that seems like a bit of a pain. The one that's really interesting is Blacephalon against Mewtwo Mew, and it realistically comes down to the same thing we were talking about with those big tag team GXs. Mewtwo Mew struggles in the same way, but it does have the saving grace of the Espeon Deoxys GX attack. So as long as Mewtwo Mew can take 3 knockouts, knock out 3 Blacephalon, or take 3 knockouts at all, like, you know, you're allowed to knock out things that aren't Blacephalon, but if you can do that, you can then potentially swing a big SBDO play, take 3 prizes on Pidgeottos on the bench and win the game that way. So that would be why Mewtwo Mew is a more even matchup than a favourable one for Blacephalon. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how that matchup goes. I can definitely see it going both ways.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the closer matchups in the format. I've heard a lot of people saying that Mewtwo's favoured and some people saying that Blacephalon's favoured, so even seems like a pretty good place to put that. Pidgeotto as well, obviously, going to be a pretty even matchup because you've got that Victini to try and shuffle your energy back into the deck, which is going to be really strong, but for the most part, they're still Pidgeotto, they're still going to annoy you a whole bunch, and you are a bit of a clunky, inconsistent deck at times. But yeah, overall, seems like Blacephalon is not too bad to play if you're not expecting Malamar or Fortress Dolls to pop up. Then your matchup spread is really strong, having a lot of good matchups against top decks, but those are 2 pretty hard auto losses, so it is a little sketchy.
Yeah, it is a little bit risky. We go on to Gardevoir. This obviously just won a regional championship in America, so it's definitely one that's going to be on people's radars. It's got some interesting matchups floating around, in that it probably wins against Blacephalon, Mew Mew, and ADP, but Mewtwo and Mew and ADP could both very easily win that matchup if they tech for it. So, like, we're saying that it's favourable, but I could definitely see Gardevoir losing to those 2 decks.
Yeah, this is a very interesting one because obviously it's got a lot of hype after just coming out from a big win in Daytona just recently. So I think that momentum could very easily carry over into Brisbane. But now that it's kind of known that it's a popular archetype again, I think it's going to kind of fall prey to some of these unfavorable matchups. Some of these stall decks are going to be a big problem for you because you are a pretty linear deck for the most part. You don't really have good answers to Doles, or you don't have good answers to hand control for the most part unless you tech for those matchups, which you can do. There's definitely things you can put in to try and swing those matchups, but just for a base list, I'd say those are pretty hard to deal with. And then, of course, you've got those big quick fire welder decks and Baby Cephalon and Abilities Art, which are going to be pretty tough to deal with just because they can just apply lots of pressure, knock out your Gardevoirs pretty easily and just win the prize trade because you are definitely a slower deck. But for the most part, the rest of the matchups are either pretty even or favorable, and you are a fairly consistent deck for the most part. You don't really need much to get going as long as you're able to find the fairies on pretty quickly. That's why the Malamar matchup, I think, is pretty even. It really, once again, depends on what your list is. If you've got a whole bunch of healing cards, for example, or you've got that Xerneas GX to try and GX attack to move the damage back to Malamar, then Malamar can really struggle to take their prizes. But at the same time, if Malamar just gets that turn 2 Shadow Impact and starts hitting you for 130 for a half hit carry almost every turn, then it might be hard for you to take 6 prizes before they eventually get there. So that's a pretty even one. And the favorable matchups, they're kind of good for the most part, honestly. Like, none of them are too bad, but once again, it depends on what cards people are playing in the decks.
Yeah, exactly. So Gardevoir I'd be a little bit shaky about picking, but you know, there's definitely answers for some of these big tag team decks in there. You can play the Lugia GX to Lost Zone things. You can do all sorts. So it's not the end of the world. If you choose Gardevoir, you're obviously going to be playing a little bit of a stally deck, but nothing quite like those terrible Pidgeotto stall and Florges Dolls decks that I have no interest in playing or playing against. So I guess Gardevoir is a respectable choice. Of the 5, I'd say it's probably the one that I'd be least likely to play, but I definitely expect to see people playing it. Like, it's gonna be good. And another deck that I also think is probably going to see a bit of play, and it's a bit of a surprise to see it on a top 5 list because I thought it was going away for a bit, but no, it's back. It's Malamar.
Never think that it's going away, Mitch. This deck is always going to be relevant. But yeah, it's definitely not the best deck in format that people have thought it might have been in the past when the Baby Cephalon was first being introduced to the deck. A lot of people had high hopes for it, but now it's kind of just settled into a pretty even-ish spread against the meta. It's got a lot of favorable matchups, as we can see at first glance looking at this chart here. Obviously, both of the Blacephalon decks you've kind of always been favorable against, so those are definitely good matchups to have, especially since Baby Blacephalon looking like it's rising up in the meta and has a lot of good matchups against some of the other top decks. So Malamar being kind of like an anti-Baby Blacephalon deck, it definitely makes it a pretty decent call. And then you've also got that Mewtwo and Doles matchups as favorable. Those matchups aren't quite as favored as the Blacephalon ones, and Mewtwo, obviously, a lot of it depends on what build they're playing and what techs they've gone for, but at least for a decent amount of the Mewtwo list, they're not going to be tech for you. They're not going to be able to deal with just consistent Shadow Impact pressure from you. So as long as you sit up against some Mewtwo lists, you should just win most of the time, especially if you're playing that Shadow Box Mimikyu. And then the Florges Dolls decks, once again, that comes down to which cards you're playing. If you're playing a lot of the good techs, such as Psy-Power Mew, the what's it called? The new Blacephalon. I forgot the attack's called.
Fireworks Bomb.
Yeah, that's the one. I got it. And of course, good old Espeon Deoxys as well is going to be pretty strong in those matchups. They are playing cards like Skypillar as their stadium, which is kind of awkward for you, but you do still play at least 4 stadiums in most Malamar lists. So for the most part, you should be able to replace their stadium and deal a whole bunch of damage to their bench. Eventually, kind of whittle down their resources and stop them from being able to chain Doles into the active every turn. So that matchup should be pretty even, but once again, it really depends on which card you choose to play on your list, because you are playing Malamar, so you can't choose to play all of the decks. You kind of just have to choose a couple decks that you want to give yourself an advantage against and focus the rest of the list on consistency.
Yeah, exactly. And having those unfavorable matchups on the right-hand side, Ability Zard, that is probably not a super great matchup for Malamar, just because the Heat Train is so hard to deal with. And ADP is obviously a horrific matchup, and ADP is a deck I'd expect to see a lot of. You could potentially play the Ultra Necrozma, which some decks have been putting in there in order to give yourself an out to a big one-shot on an ADP, which they probably aren't expecting. It also gives you the potential to Sky Scorching Light against some of these other decks that might put some basics onto the field that have 70 or 60 HP. But I'd still feel pretty average if I was going up against ADP with Malamar. I'd be a bit concerned. Of the 5, this is the one that I think is going to see the least play. But it definitely has potential, and there's no reason why it can't do well. I mean, it was in top 8 recently at Daytona, and it's got a lot of results behind it already, so I wouldn't be surprised to see Malamar being successful in Brisbane as well.
Yeah, this is actually the one that I'm the least sure about of all the decks on this list. The first 3 we talked about, I'm pretty certain they're all going to see high play at some point or another. I think that the Gardevoir deck's going to still be big just because it did come off of that win in Daytona, although I think it's going to drop down a little bit as opposed to last weekend. But Malamar to me is the dark horse on this list. I really could very easily see it being one of the most popular decks of the tournament. I could easily see it being in like the top 3 most played decks because it definitely looks like it's a pretty decent medical, and there are decks you can play to try and swing those bad matchups like the ADP. But I could also see it barely showing up, so I know a lot of people get scared off by it. ADP being a bad matchup definitely is a big deterrent to play this deck, so this is the kind of one where I could either see it just being like one of the biggest decks of the tournament. I also would be surprised if it barely shows up at all. But one thing's for sure, at least some people are going to play it, and looks like it's got a pretty good chance.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, Jordan, you're going to the event, so you're probably going to play Malamar. That's all you ever play. So, no, just kidding. But it's one of those decks that definitely needs to be on the radar. At this stage, I'm not sure what I'm going to play. Like, as we're recording it, it's almost 6 o'clock on Thursday night. I fly out in 24 hours for Brisbane, and I still have no idea what I'm going to play for this event. The meta seems very, very even. It seems very dependent on getting a little bit lucky here and there. There's obviously things you can do to win some matchups that might be bad, but I don't know what I'm going to play. I don't know about you, Jordan. This one seems like a tough call.
Yeah, it certainly is. I'm not sure either. This meta looks pretty wide open at this point. I could honestly even see myself playing one of the decks that we didn't even feature in the top 5 here. So definitely a lot of good options in this format. I don't think that there's like a BDIF in this format that seems like pretty much every deck has a good chance, and a lot of it is matchup dependent, of course, but a lot of the decks seem to have pretty either polarizing matchups or a pretty even 50-50 spread across the field, so it really just comes down to your playstyle of what you feel more confident in, and there really isn't a terrible choice.
Yeah, there certainly isn't. But hey, yeah, that's pretty much it. We've looked at all of the decks that we think are going to see play. Like we mentioned at the start, we're probably going to have a couple of days where there aren't videos out, just whilst we're over in Brisbane. We're in the middle of showing off our cup at the moment, so those ones will probably have to wait a little bit for next week, but that's okay. We'll get them out, and yeah, we'll see how we go into the summer break. It'll be interesting to see how Pokemon shapes up. Like, here's the thing, Jordan, this is our last big event before like Melbourne Internationals. Like, that's how long it takes for us to have events in Australia, so it's important that we get this one right.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy to think about that. Hopefully we'll have some success stories and we'll be able to talk about some coverage of things that happen in Brisbane, but that's pretty much all we have to say before the event. We'll just have to wait and see what happens in Brisbane.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'll see you there, Jordan.
Certainly will.
And hopefully we see you there as well. If you are there, give us a shout, like say hi. We'll love to chat to you, because you know, like, we know most of the people in Australia anyway. But if we don't know you, then please let us know so we can know you. But yeah, we'll be there. Look out for the Sableye mats and stuff like that. We'll be around. Thanks, Jordan, for having this chat.
Not a problem.
And thanks everyone for watching. If you like the content, consider subscribing if you haven't already by clicking the Sableye in the middle of the screen. On the left-hand side, we've got some videos that YouTube thinks you'll like, and on the right-hand side, we've got a playlist of some description. Don't know what it will be just yet. Probably our deck profile, so you can go back and have a look at some of the older lists for the decks that we've seen today. If you follow us on Facebook or Twitter, I mean, if you don't follow us, so you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at the Sableyes_YT, and apart from that, that is all I have to say. We'll see you later. See you in Brisbane. And, yeah, catch you next time. Bye.